No longer a witch hunt. Duncan Hunter now says he's guilty of corruption. What's next for the East County congressman and those running to replace him? An inconvenient truth. Al Gore brings his climate message to San Diego as scientists escalate their warning for our planet. And more than an inconvenience, how the water problem in Poway could end up costing the city millions. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, columnist Michael Smolens of the San Diego Union-Tribune, KPBS reporter Matt Hoffman, reporter Priya Sridhar of KPBS News, and Eric Anderson, also with KPBS. He covers the environment. Well, it turns out it wasn't a hoax, nor was it fake news or a witch hunt. Republican Duncan Hunter pleaded guilty this week to campaign finance crimes. He faces up to 5 years in federal prison, will surrender his seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. In the 3 years since the Union Tribune broke the story of gross misuse of campaign funds by Hunter and his wife Margaret, the congressman has claimed both innocence and victimhood. Now he's saying he made some mistakes. Well, here's what Philip Halpern, a prosecutor in the case, said outside the courthouse following Hunter's plea.
No figure, regardless of the heights they've reached, no figure, regardless of what they've contributed, and no figure, regardless of what office they occupy, should be allowed in this country to cry witch hunt or fake news and attempt to deflect their criminal wrongdoings.
And Michael, as we've talked about on this show, your colleague Morgan Cook reported spending irregularities from campaign funds, video games, and whatnot at the beginning. But when the indictment came down last year against the Hunters, this thing had really mushroomed beyond that.
Well, it did. It was like 68 video game uses. I think a total of $1,300 was her first story that looked at some problems. And like you say, things mushroomed. Ultimately, Duncan Hunter and his wife, Margaret, who was the campaign manager, were accused basically of stealing $250,000 from their campaign to use personally. And there were, we mentioned 60 charges. There was fraud, there was conspiracy, wire fraud, and falsifying documents. So they really threw the book at them.
Yeah, and this spending pattern went on for a long, long time. And
almost since from the start he was in office. I think they started looking at saying no later than 2010, and he went into office in 2009. And
as we say, when the indictment came down, it was pretty comprehensive, and it was very long. And now we had a plea from Margaret Hunter last summer, and this was a conspiracy of two, so it wasn't looking good at that point for Duncan Hunter, since she was working with the government at that point.
Right, and basically they both pleaded guilty to one count of conspiracy to convert these campaign funds for personal use, and to knowingly do so, which is sort of runs counter to what Duncan Hunter is saying, that he wasn't keeping track of accounting and things like that. Halpern made clear that.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a moment here. And Priya, set the scene for it. The courthouse this week. Hunter say anything after his plea deal?
Not much. Inside the courtroom, he pretty much just said guilty every time the judge read one of the charges, and that's obviously what he was pleading to. He had done an exclusive interview with KUSI, another local station here in San Diego, the day before, basically stating that he was going to plead guilty, and he said the reason he did that was because of his 3 children. He essentially didn't want to put them through a public trial. He did make a brief statement after he left the courtroom, basically saying that I did make mistakes, and that's what today was about. And he was going to be making more statements in the future about the future. All
right. Well, you've set that up nicely here, because we've got a bite talking about the mistakes now, and an interview with KPBS's Jade Hindman previously, months ago, on this. Let's hear that.
I failed to monitor and account for my campaign spending. I made mistakes, and that's what today was all about. So that being said, I'll have more statements in the future about the future. Thank you.
Did you misuse campaign funds? No. Were there mistakes made?
No.
No mistakes made?
I did not misuse any campaign funds, but thank you for asking.
Well, it seems like a little two sides to that one as we go along. The sentences here, what do we know? When's the sentencing going to be? As I said at the outset, I think 5 years is the upside of that. Nobody thinks he's going to spend 5 years in prison.
That's right. So the sentencing is set for March 17th, and he faces up to 5 years in jail, a $250,000 fine, and 3 years of a probationary period, essentially, upon release. And those are the same things that his wife, Margaret Hunter, faces. Her sentencing is in April. He did say in the interview with KUSI that he was hoping that by pleading guilty, it could perhaps reduce, if not get rid of, any jail time that Margaret would serve, because he said that he's hoping that she could be in the home with his 3 kids. We did get a chance to ask the federal prosecutors about that on Tuesday, and they said while they do keep family considerations into account with sentencing, that his guilty plea would have nothing to do with her sentencing. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
Well, I think
Michael?
also her sentencing might have to do with the fact that she cooperated with the prosecutor.
Way back when, yeah.
They were in this together, and then she pleaded guilty and was turning state's evidence on him, and she obviously had a lot because she ran the campaign.
Well, let's turn now to, and there's an ethical question journalistically about that KUSI, and just for the record, I want to say that the questions were given by Hunter to the KUSI folks, and pretty much had that a scripted interview here. So he's really controlled what's been said. But we're going to move on now to the 50th district. Now, it's assumed Hunter will step down, and I don't want to get all into the weeds on this special election, but it's a confusing situation right now.
Yeah, it is, and we asked if that was part of the negotiations with the plea deal, and the prosecutors essentially said that it wasn't officially part of the negotiations. It was never written into the plea deal, which I read, but it was sort of understood by the defense team that he would eventually step down. So now Governor Gavin Newsom has basically a lot of the power in this scenario. He can choose to either hold a special election, which there would be a primary, and if one of the candidates got 50% of the vote, they would basically serve out the rest of his term until next January.
Next year,
correct. Yeah. Or Governor Newsom could choose to leave that seat vacant, and then we would just go ahead with the general election as scheduled. That primary was scheduled for March 3rd, and then the regular election would be in November. So we don't really know what's going to happen yet.
All right, and let's take a look at the candidates out there so far, Michael, for the 50th. Some of them don't even live in the 50th district, right?
Well, there's really 4 now key candidates. Carl DeMaio, the former San Diego City Council member, Darrell Issa, the former congressman, the lone Democrat, Amar Campa-Najjar, who, as we very much remember, almost defeated Duncan Hunter last year.
Within a few percentage points.
And then State Senator Brian Jones from Santee.
Okay.
And you mentioned that people not living there. DeMaio and Issa do not live in the district, but on balance, and to be fair, Issa represented part of that, what is now the 50th district before the lines were changed in his old 49th, if it was still called that then. And Carl DeMaio, he's sort of a regional political figure. He's run for mayor. After his stint at City Hall, he was a radio talk show host, which, of course, I'm sure beamed into the 50th district. He's been spending a lot of time there, so he's a known entity as well.
I'm kind of curious to see if Duncan Hunter actually endorses any of the candidates and if they would even want his endorsement. But obviously, that is their family has been a political dynasty for almost 50 years.
That's like Michael Corleone endorsing Fredo there in Havana, is it not? And Godfather 2. So let's talk about Campa-Najjar. He's the lone Democrat. So let's say we play it out normally. Here we have our March primary early in California this year. We go on to the general election. It's almost certain that the Democrat will, with some 30-some percentage of the vote, be one of the candidates there, and then one of these others you've mentioned, Michael. Nobody
seems to doubt that. When Darrell Issa, announced, he said it's going to be Campa-Najjar, the same scenario you mentioned, that just that bulk of Democrats. It's very interesting because the Republicans still have the upper hand. It's a very Republican district. Probably the worst scenario for them would have been if somehow Hunter stayed in the race, won the primary. A lot of people smarter than I seem to think that was obviously the best scenario for Campa-Najjar. Some people seem to think any of the other Republicans are well enough known, will have a good enough organization that they should win that November because, again, it's one of the reddest districts in California. But having said that, this election could be crazy, and I wouldn't count Najjar out.
Yeah, it could be very crazy, Matt.
I mean, I don't want to backpedal a little bit, but when you talk about Duncan Hunter changing his plea to guilty, I mean, that was pretty big. I mean, that's a major development. I mean, his wife had already pleaded guilty too, so you got to wonder, why is he doing it now? I mean, is it...
why didn't he do it way back when maybe he would have got a little favorable treatment on the sentencing?
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of speculation about that, and we talked to Michael Vu, the Registrar of Voters, and he said that he hadn't even turned in his re-election papers into the Registrar of Voters,
Hunter
which were due. No, he hadn't. Today on Friday, so that should indicate that he was thinking about pleading guilty, because he would have known that being convicted of that serious of a crime, you can't run for office. Right. So it seems like it must have been going on behind the scenes, but I don't know about the timing.
He still had an appeal pending, and he could have taken it all the way to the Supreme Court, probably could have dragged on this trial. You got to wonder if that was some leverage.
You've got the federal government with all the resources in the world, and clearly, I mean, they were struggling for money. They were struggling for money because that's why he was stealing campaign funds.
We spent money on
he rung up huge bills. There seemed now certain obvious guilt. I mean, there's always this debate: was she more culpable than him? Well, I mean, I think that's almost a moot point now. And let's face it, negotiations take a long time on these things. Both sides are trying to get the best deal. And let's not forget that he was changing attorneys at the same time as well. So, but the timing is interesting that it comes right before all these deadlines.
Well, plenty more grist for our mill. We're going to move on here, but we got plenty to talk about as we move into the election season here. We are going to move on. We're closing out a bleak decade in the struggle to slow the Earth's warming. Reports coinciding with the United Nations meeting on climate change in Madrid this week show global greenhouse gas emissions will set another record in 2019, rising by 0.6%. The latest UN study concluded that emissions need to drop sharply by 7.6% annually starting next year if we're going to meet the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius set in the Paris Climate Accord. And Eric, though President Trump says the U.S. is dropping out of the Paris Accord, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and 14 other Democrats went to Madrid. Their message is quite different.
Nancy Pelosi told the members gathered in Madrid that she's interested in letting them know that the United States is still technically in the Paris Climate Accord. Of course, the decision to withdraw the request to withdraw has been made by the Trump administration, but it doesn't take effect until the day after the election
in 2020.
So the United States is still in. In fact, the United States did send an official government delegation. You might have heard of these names. Kim Carnahan and Marcia Bernacat are leading that delegation. They're both
Who's that?
Officials. They're both officials in the State Department. Okay. Marcia is a principal deputy assistant secretary.
Oh, okay.
So not completely off the table, but certainly not going there. The president, the head of state, not going there, and not sending top diplomats to go there. So obviously, President Trump doesn't think much of this climate gathering. But when you listen to the UN chief, when he opened the conference a few days ago, what he had to say was pretty, darn urgent. He said, look, the time has come to act drastically, because if we don't, then we're going to quickly pass the point of no return.
Yeah, and this year we saw the surge in protests. Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager.
She arrived there today, by the way.
Right, and she has made international news in this front. We've had walkouts here right at this university, throughout San Diego, cities across the world. I mean, it's been just remarkable. 153 countries, 2,300 cities had walkouts just going up to this Madrid conference. We're talking about this like never before.
Yes, it is definitely a part of the conversation, and you start to feel that. Unfortunately, there was a candidate in the presidential race the governor of Washington, who had made environment the centerpiece of his campaign, and he just didn't get the kind of traction and support that he wanted. But it is part of the conversation, and I think you're starting to see that as well.
And Michael, I want to get to the whole politics of this in a second, but Eric, you covered former Vice President, longtime climate activist Al Gore's speech in San Diego recently. What's his take on that? And we're going to set up a bite here where he's got some optimism.
He is a wonderful presenter of the slideshow, we'll put it that way. He talked to a select audience at the Salk Institute earlier this week on Tuesday night. And he told them basically, look, all the evidence is there. There are serious challenges facing us, the extreme weather events that are happening, the firestorms that are happening around the state of California. That's evidence that climate change is already beginning kind of grab hold of our environment. And he said, though, that there were some things he wanted the audience to think about, and I think we have a little clip here we can play of him. But there were some things that he wanted the audience to think about as they listened to what he had to say.
All right, let's hear that clip then.
But in any case, when I support my conclusion and the scientific community's conclusion that we really have to change, don't get too depressed, because the answers to the second and third questions are actually pretty optimistic. The second question is, can we change? You know, if you have to change and you don't have the ability to change, that's a formula for some serious depression. But the answers to that question, I think you will agree, are very optimistic.
And just real quickly, the third question that he asked was, will we change? And he said that really depended on the members of the audience. And that was an important point that he kind of wrapped up with as well.
And it depends on political leaders. And Michael, I want to ask you about that. We've seen the Democrats and finally the journalists who are conducting these debates we've seen so far are asking questions about it. All the Democrats seem to have a big part of their platform, climate change, action plans. Pelosi's going to introduce this climate action legislation here. Is it making a push, because they seem to have the Republicans flat-footed on this issue?
Well, it is, in terms of what Eric was talking about, people are just more aware and more concerned. I mean, it didn't seem that long ago that these studies would come out that were saying there's a horrible future, and people just kind of went on. Now it's gotten people's attention for all the reasons you guys had mentioned. How far that goes with the partisan split, certainly this year in the Senate, who knows? Also within the Democratic Party, there's disagreement over some of the pending legislation and the Green New Deal, of course. But, the public is actually getting out ahead of the politics, I think. I think polls are showing, 8 out of 10 Americans think it's not only a problem, but that they agree humans have been contributing to a big deal. More and more people are considering it an actual crisis. So does that start moving the needle politically? But I think that, regardless, we're going to have to get through this election and see where we stand in terms of getting stuff really done.
One of the things Al Gore mentioned, too, as a sign of hope and optimism, he said there are 57 college Republican clubs around the country that have implored the Republican National Committee to change their stance on climate change, to take it seriously, to make it an issue. And he says that's a sign that there's a reason to be hopeful. And he said, it takes political will. And he said, fortunately, political will is a renewable resource. Well, and we can apply that.
It's interesting because a recent poll did say young Republicans between, I think, 18 and 35 have gone into the majority wanting more action on climate change. So that follows along that.
Well, another reason 2020 would be such a critical time to see how many young people come out and motivate this and move the established parties on this. It seems to me this is such a trunk issue. You can take any agency of the federal government, transportation, agriculture, energy, defense, right on down the line. They all branch off climate change. It affects everything, education. Eric, let's hear from Donald Trump here. We're going to bite on him, a recent climate take, and he's changing his tune a little bit. Let's hear.
I believe very strongly in very, very crystal clear, clean water and clean air. That's a big part of climate change. I also see what's happening with our oceans, where certain countries are dumping unlimited loads of things in and they float. They tend to float toward the United States. I see that happening, and nobody's ever seen anything like it, and it's gotten worse. But no, it's very important to me also. But I want clean air and clean water. That would be number one and number two.
Kind of off point, right?
Clean air and clean water, number one and number two. The head of the EPA is a former coal industry lobbyist. The Trump administration has done more to roll back environmental protections than any administration that has come before. He has made a commitment to fossil fuels that has been unprecedented. He's called for subsidizing the coal industry to make sure that industry thrives, and that's widely considered to be one of the biggest contributors to the greenhouse gases that are warming our climate. So what he says and what he's doing, there are not the same thing.
All right, we got to move on, but I'll tell you, we're going to talk about this quite a bit as we move into the election year and see what happens on this front. Well, recent rains have been welcome all across fire-weary and drought-plagued California, but an exception might be the city of Poway, as storm water caused a big headache there. And Matt, start with what's going on. This kind of sneaked up on everybody, this story.
Yeah, it really did. Last Friday, some residents, they reported some brownish-colored water coming out of the tap. And so the city of Poway started investigating. They issued a boil water notice on Saturday. Kind of out of precaution, they ran some tests. They found the water was good. That boil water notice, they closed a bunch of restaurants in the city. And the city eventually did come out earlier this week and said, listen, a storm drain was able to get into the facility, or excuse me, runoff from a storm drain was able to get in. But how did that happen? And we were able to do some digging. We talked to a state official who said after they checked it out, they found out that the city was out of compliance with state regulations. Basically, Poway had their sewer connections connected to their treated water reservoir, which it's against state regulations to protect from events like this happening.
Well, how are the people, and we're going to get back to some of the details on that in a minute, but what's happening in the city? How are the people and the businesses there coping?
Right. I mean, they're really doing the best they can. The city's trying to do its part. They said they've handed out over 1 million bottles of water to residents. Basically every day since Saturday, they've had all these volunteers out in 2 locations, giving people 1 case of bottled water per car. But a lot of residents aren't happy about it. They just want to know what the issue was. And then you talk about business owners, man, business owners are not happy. I mean, it's now, 7 days since the water's been off there, and the county had to shut down 190 restaurants and markets. Only about 21 of those have been able to reopen under a modified permit, meaning they have to have, food preparation off-site, and they have to have clean drinking water to wash hands.
Eric?
Didn't the mayor kind of vouch for the water supply there?
Yeah, there's been a kind of little bureaucracy battle, I guess you could say. The city of Poway was not happy that the state official told us about this before they told them about them being out of compliance, because they said that, hey, we never knew we were out of compliance. Poway Mayor Steve Voss, he said that he's still drinking the water there, and all their tests are showing that it's safe in terms of no bacteria, but the state is still concerned. There's been some low chlorine levels, so they just want to double check, because if they've been flushing the system so much that there should be higher chlorine levels, so still waiting on testing.
That sets up a nice clip we have here, a nice segue from Mayor Steve Voss of Poway. Let's hear that.
I was stunned. I was stunned by it because just a couple months ago in September, we had a annual report of sorts, no mention of this storm drain, clear well non-compliance issue. That's been in operation over 50 years. Never in those 50 years has there been any mention of that. So, yeah, I'm stunned and frustrated because we've got a town that wants to get back to normal and folks that want to get back to work.
All right, and he makes the point there. I mean, we've had a lot of rain in recent winters. Granted, we've obviously had our years of drought, but a lot of drought-busting rains we've had. This thing, as he says, has been around there half a century. Why now?
Right, and he also pointed out that the state did some sanitation checks and they never reported anything. The state right now is going back, looking over those checks to make sure, to see if they did point out or they didn't point it out. But to go back to your original question, wait, what was your original question again? I already forgot it.
Well, the whole thing is why now? Why is it happening
why now?
now?
Okay,
why
yeah,
did it
that's
sneak
right.
up on them?
So basically there was like this flap, and during the storm drains it got stuck down, and then that's what overflowed into the treated, the already treated water.
So they've already discovered the actual
They discovered the problem. The city of Poway's made the temporary fix, and now the temporary fix, they bolted down that hatch, they sealed it, the state's inspected it, they said it's good to go. The recent rains hasn't had any effect on that, but the long-term fix, a multi-million-dollar project, capital improvement project, is being described as. The city of Poway has acknowledged that they are going to have to do that. It's not something they need to do right now, but it will require city council approval, and ultimately taxpayers will be the ones footing the bill.
Is there a sense of when they will get back to normal, as the mayor is hoping for, the restaurants, the stores? There's some coming online, but is there any sort of timeline?
Right. I talked to the state official. He said 7 p.m. tonight. Sorry, 7 p.m. Friday, I should say, is the day. They're still waiting for some testing results. They get them back. He said they're going to get the latest one 7 p.m. on Friday, which is today. And if those are good to go, then they could lift the boil water advisory by today. If not, if there's some problems, then it could go into the weekend. Lots of people, though, really want this lifted, as soon as possible. Restaurants are just waiting to open. Now,
the terrible water situation in Flint, Michigan, of course, that's made national, international news for several years now. Right. Whole different cause, and we won't get into that. But the issue of trust becomes one. The people of Flint, they've the governor comes and drinks the water there, and U.S. senators come and she'll drink the water and say it's okay. And a lot of people just don't trust it. They're not buying it. Right. What do you think about the folks in Poway? You think this is an issue of trust now?
There's definitely distrust, and it's sort of like, who do we believe? Do we believe the city or do we believe the state? because the state's kind of saying one thing, the city's saying another thing. City's saying, hey, we're just kind of waiting on the state to give us the all clear. The state has guidelines that they need to follow. But no, a lot of people, we actually broke that story about how they were out of compliance, and a lot of people were like, I knew something was wrong. How could, stormwater get into already treated water? Obviously, we know now is because the overflow system should be nowhere near this treated water. So I think that there is a little bit of distrust. It'll be interesting to see. A lot of residents were upset at the most recent city council meeting. That was before the story came out about them being out of compliance. So we'll see if there's some people who want some answers.
Any idea if other cities in the county or elsewhere in California have similar kind of problems or are vulnerable to this?
Well, so the city of Poway only supplies water for Poway residents. So it's contained to inside the city. But I talked to a state water official who's in charge of San Diego and Imperial counties. He said that he'd have to think hard for a long time to see if he remembers something that was this widespread going on for this long. But all indications are right now is that the water tests are coming back good, which is good, really good for people to hear. Although state water officials say, don't drink that water until we give the all clear, although, the mayor's saying he's drinking it. But.
Okay, a couple seconds left. The millions it would take to fix this ultimately, some sort of bond issue, raise taxes. They're going to have to come up with money that's not budgeted.
Right, yeah. Who knows if they're going to have to raise water rates. I don't know if they have a capital improvement fund or an emergency fund. But yeah, ultimately taxpayers are going to be the ones footing the bill here. All
right, something to watch going forward again. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable, and I'd like to thank my guests, Michael Smolens of the San Diego Union Tribune, Matt Hoffman of KPBS News, Priya Sridhar and Eric Anderson, both of KPBS News. A lot of our folks here today. That makes it handy and good. Well, a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. And I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today, and join us again next Friday on the Roundtable.